Every one of us in HR has had that moment where an employee says, I'm going to need some time off. I'm not sure how much. Or my doctor says I may need to leave here and there. And instantly, our brain goes, is this FMLA? What's the next step? FMLA isn't complicated because people make it difficult. It's complicated because the law has specific timelines, notices, and moving parts that we in HR have to coordinate. So today we're going deep into what every HR professional needs to know with a real story that shows exactly why our roles matter so much. After 20 years in HR, I've learned this. FMLA goes smoothly when we guide the process. Employees want clarity, leaders want to do the right thing, and we're the ones that bridge that gap. So today we're going beyond the basics into practical, real-world side of FMLA that we deal with every single day. These are things like notice rules, communication, extended leave, certification, intermittent leave, and what happens when any part of that process falls apart. First, let's talk about what qualifies as a covered employer and the rules that change that math. FMLA applies to employers with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius during the current or previous calendar year. But headcount isn't always simple. There are two rules that can completely change coverage. Those are the Integrated Employer Rule and Joint Employer Rule. These are where many organizations get blindsided, especially if you're a part of a private equity portfolio company or if you have less than 50 employees, but you utilize an agency for labor and that agency has more than 50 employees. First, let's talk about the Integrated Employer Rule. The Department of Labor may treat multiple companies as one employer if they operate in a significantly connected way. If there's common management, there's interrelated operations, there's centralized control of labor decisions, or common ownership or financial control. If those exist, employee counts can get combined. This rule is extremely important inside private equity portfolios because PE structures often appear independent on paper, but they're deeply connected operationally. For example, if a PE firm owns partial stakes in 3 companies, Blue Air HVAC has 18 employees and the PE owns 40%. Prime Flow Plumbing, 15 employees, the PE owns 55%. And third, Bright Spark Electrical, 22 employees, the PE owns 30%. They each have separate brands, different leadership teams, different ownership mixes, and a separate customer base. But behind the scenes, if the PE firm centralizes the payroll system, HR and benefits, requires approval for major hiring and compensation decisions, uses one applicant tracking system, or shares regional leaders, like if they have a regional VP across entities, those factors can cause the Department of Labor to treat the companies as one employer. Their combined headcount, 18 plus 15 plus 22, that's 55 employees, which means they are a covered employer under FMLA, even though individually they fall below the 50. Now let's talk about the Joint Employer Rule. Here's the second rule HR needs to understand, and this one impacts small businesses constantly. Joint employment happens when 2 employers both share control over an employee's work, which is extremely common with temporary staffing agencies. The key rule to remember: if either employer meets the 50 employee requirement, the employee is FMLA eligible. This surprises a lot of employers. Real world example: small company plus staffing agency. A small business has 28 employees of its own and 18 temporary workers from a staffing agency. They assume we're too small for FMLA. But the staffing agency has 300 plus employees, multiple client sites, and it has its own HR team and benefits. The staffing agency is a covered employer, and because both the staffing agency and the small business share control over the temp worker's employment, the Department of Labor considers them joint employers. What's the result? The temporary workers are FMLA eligible, the small company has obligations during the leave, and both companies must coordinate compliance. This is one of the most common and most overlooked FMLA pitfalls for small and mid-sized companies. Now we're going to talk about employee notice requirements. Today we're just talking about federal FMLA. This is where most FMLA issues start because there are a lot of moving parts. Let's first talk about foreseeable leave. This is when an employee knows in advance that they're going to need leave. In that case, they are required to give 30 days notice. If that's not possible, they need to give notice as soon as practicable, usually the same or next business day that they're calling out. An unforeseeable leave, employees must notify us as soon as they reasonably can. Now, that could be a quick morning call, a message saying that they're heading to urgent care, or it could even mean a spouse is calling in on their behalf. Now, remember, they don't have to say the words FMLA. They just have to give enough information so that we can recognize a potential qualifying reason. This is where our HR radar kicks in. But here's the important part. Employees don't usually call into HR first. They usually call into their manager. When the employee calls the manager instead of HR under FMLA, a manager's knowledge is the company's knowledge. That means if an employee tells their supervisor something that could be FMLA related, like, hey, I'm having surgery next month, or hey, my mom's in the hospital, I need to care for her, the company's considered to have received notice, even if HR never hears about it. If that manager doesn't pass it along, the employer as a whole can still be held responsible for failing to provide FMLA rights. That's called interference because the company, through its agent, the manager, prevented the employee from exercising their rights, even if it's unintentional. Manager training is so critical. Every supervisor needs to know the phrases and scenarios that should trigger a call or email to HR. We can make it easy. Create a quick reference guide or Teams form for managers to flag potential FMLA situations. If we build that communication bridge, we prevent 90% of FMLA problems before they even start. Let's talk about the employer notice requirements. The minute we become aware of a potential FMLA situation, our clock starts. We have 5 business days to send the eligibility notice, the rights and responsibilities notice. Then, once certification's in, we have another 5 business days to send the designation notice. These timelines aren't suggestions. They are requirements under FMLA and the Department of Labor, and they protect both the employee and the organization. Let's talk about a real case study here. Here's a real situation I'm familiar with, and it's a perfect example of why our coordination and communication matters. An employee that I know let his manager know months in advance that he needed hip surgery. The manager acknowledged it, but HR isn't on site at that company and nothing moved forward. No eligibility notice, no rights and responsibilities notice, no certification packet, nothing. So the employee continued to work through worsening pain until he physically couldn't do it anymore. When he told his manager he needed time away until surgery, again, the process didn't move. He eventually called HR himself. HR said they'd mailed the paperwork, but nothing arrived. So during the months he waited, he ended up needing a heart stent before the hip surgery. So the leave extended to nearly 8 months. Now, this employee stayed in touch with his manager the entire time. But then he had all of this surgery done. He had the heart stent put in. He had the hip replacement and was recovering, continuing to stay in touch with his manager. And weeks before he was ready to return, his manager called him and said that, hey, I'm being moved to another location and you'll need to work with this new manager when they get hired in order to be able to return. He also mentioned at that time, hey, HR isn't sure if they're going to be able to keep you active. They might need to terminate and rehire you later. He called HR and said again, hey, I never received any of the paperwork. HR responded with, oh, well, we'll send it again. So here's the issue from an HR perspective. The employee gave foreseeable notice. We as employers have 5 business days to send the required notices. Since those notices were never received, his leave was never designated, his job protection was never confirmed, there's no consistent documentation, and HR is questioning whether he can remain active. The risk here can be very serious. When an employee gives notice and the employer fails to issue the required documents, the employee may still be legally protected under FMLA even if their leave was beyond the 12 weeks since they didn't receive the required notice informing them so. Termination could be viewed as interference or retaliation, and the employee may have rights to reinstatement, back pay, lost benefits, continued tenure, vacation accrual status, retirement vesting, and health coverage continuation. Courts often see failures to send notices as preventing the employee from exercising their rights, even if it wasn't intentional. This story just goes to show how easily things can fall through the cracks when our systems or communication breaks down. So that will lead us right into communication with employees. This is where we prevent most problems. When we clearly explain the process, everything goes so much smoother. Employees need to know how to call off, what FMLA protects and what it doesn't, that they have 15 days to return the certification, or longer if your company allows, how intermittent leave works, what updates we need from them, and that we'll stay in touch throughout their leave. Most employees assume that telling their manager equals telling HR. Most managers assume that acknowledging the need equals HR being informed. Now remember, we're the ones that have to connect those dots, which can sometimes be challenging. So next, let's talk about certification and recertification. What can we request? We're allowed to request certification that includes frequency, duration, treatment schedule, functional limitations, essential duties the condition impacts, but we cannot request the diagnosis. Recertification is allowed when the pattern changes, the leave extends, it's been 6 months, or we receive new information. Our role is to align the usage with the medical information. Our job is not to judge it. So next, let's talk about intermittent leave. Probably one of the biggest HR challenges. Intermittent leave is where we spend most of our FMLA time. We have to track the leave in the smallest increments our system uses. We have to make sure usage matches the certification. We have to help managers understand how it works. We have to recertify when the patterns shift. And we have to stay consistent. This isn't about catching misuse. It's about making sure that the leave follows the medical guidance. Next, let's talk about documentation. Protecting us and the company. In FMLA, documentation is really everything. We should document the first notice, every form that's sent, the call-off patterns, certifications, corrections, recertifications, follow-up communication, and return to work and fitness for duty requirements. Excuse me. If something becomes a claim, your documentation is going to become your full story. FMLA isn't overwhelming when we guide the process. Clear communication, timely notices, consistent documentation, and supportive conversations with the employee, that's how we protect our employees, support our leaders, and we keep the company compliant. If you want a separate video on intermittent leave, what qualifies as a serious health condition, or how to coach managers through their role in FMLA, just let me know. I'm happy to turn this into a whole series. We all know there is a lot that goes into FMLA.